Well, my lords, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to the Freedom Association's Brexit Unbound Conference. We're now nearly 10 years on from Brexit, it's the 23rd of June, and I find myself having to repeat arguments that I was making 10 years ago, or even as an MEP the 10 years before that. It's rather like Groundhog Day. And it's nice of Steve Bray to add to the touch. You know, he's been doing that for 10 years. Fortunately, he's calmed down a bit. Some now put the date of Brexit as when we actually left, the 31st of January 2020. I actually see the date of Brexit as when it's the day the British people, despite numerous threats and horror stories, they had the courage and integrity and resolve to vote to leave the European Union. It was a brave step. And that was the 23rd of June 2016. They knew there would be some pain and some cost, but I always thought it was like moving house. You know there's going to be some pain and cost, but you do it for the wider benefits. Now, we do seem to have some very over-enthusiastic Labour candidates who want to become Prime Minister, who seem to have zero respect for democracy, for millions of their own voters. Lord Redwood here, and are proud to betray Brexit. I'm delighted we have like Kelvin and Barras Hoey, and we have a great representation actually of Labour Eurosceptics. There aren't many of them, but they are very good people and they are really important to the cause. So thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. I wanted to point out, by the way, that Labour did win the last election, as we know, but they only achieved 9.7 million votes, and they went up 1.6%. And that was out of 28.8 million that actually voted. The Conservatives collapsed, as we know, by 20%, and Starmer's own vote in his own constituency went down 17% in the last election. Now compare that to the 46.5 million who voted in total in the Brexit referendum, with Leave winning by 17.4 million votes. I mean, that's nearly twice the vote in the general election for Labour. So how do Bannerman and Streeting, and now Starmer, think they have any mandate for such a Brexit betrayal? Because that's what it is, a Brexit betrayal. I know Burnham's fast retreating because he's got a seat in Wakefield that is 66% pro-Brexit. I wonder if Starmer and Mr. Streeting might secretly wish that Burnham should fail to reform in that by-election. Well, let's give them a helping hand, shall we? Let's make sure it happens. Now, we've got excellent lineup today. We've got a really quality lineup. And I'm really delighted at that, and we'll be firing off shortly. I have a confession to make, by the way, that I was actually the flatmate with the man who invented the word Brexit. Officially, the Oxford English Dictionary, and it's Peter Wilding. I don't know if you've heard of Peter. And it was a May 2012 Your Active blog where he combined Brexit and exit, British and exit, beg your pardon. Now, Peter was a Remainer, and we used to have vigorous pre-referendum debates on the balcony in Brussels at Square Marie Louise, and we're still great friends, and I think that's very important to underline that, you know, if you respect democracy, you can retain friendships. I wanted to look today at the positives of Brexit. I'm tired, I'm sure everyone here in the room is tired of the myths and the untruths that have been fired at Brexit. And I think, you know, we can't just sort of let it go. We've got to fight back, and we've got to point out some home truths. And I think a lot of the speakers today will be doing that, and to knock back these negative and dishonest claims. I talk about brand Brexit. I was in advertising, you know, Cousins, Imperial Leather, and Sony, and Our White's Lemonade. Remember that? I worked on that. I'm into brands, but no one has been supporting brand Brexit, have they? I mean, Coke spends hundreds of millions every year. not since Boris and his boosterism and global Britain and all of that. I mean, you know, we look around and even the Conservatives don't mention it much. What's happened to free ports? Sunak was keen on free ports, quite rightly, but, you know, the Conservatives are not mentioning it. And Reform aren't really mentioning Brexit. It's more immigration. And I think that is regretful. You know, we've got to fight for Brexit and we've got to push back because otherwise our opponents have a clear run to plant some very dubious facts in the public mind. And you know how Wes Streeting calling it a catastrophic error. You know, this is not true. It's not a fair reflection of what has been achieved in the last 10 years based on the hard facts, many of which you'll hear today. And so I want to see the Conservatives and Reform push back on Brexit. They need to. You know, we can't just sort of let this go. Now, obviously, what the polling says, by the way, is not that Brexit's failed, that we failed to deliver it in full and properly. And that's very different. And, you know, that's a perception that's taken root. But we must fight back on these falsehoods. And I'm going to just touch, just to say that, you know, I don't expect us to have rose-tinted spectacles on Brexit. It's not perfect. Nothing on this earth is perfect. But we do need a realistic, honest, and pragmatic setting out of the benefits of Brexit so far. And that's the point of today. You know, let's start pushing back. I mean, just one killer fact, by the way, that, you know, I think we can learn a lot from the United States. And the killer fact is that 25 years ago, the EU and the US were broadly had the same wealth, national wealth. But now the USA is 50% greater than the EU, 50%. And that is the cost of over-regulation, bad policy, and costly bureaucracy. And that, even the German Chancellor, Merz, now is very damning about that. So here's some positives of Brexit. I know you've been waiting for this. You don't hear these often on the media, do you? We're saving 25 billion. I mean, it's around 25 billion in fees to the EU. I don't know what Bannerman or Streeting or Starmer are going to do about that. You know, if you want to rejoin the EU, it's going to cost you 25 billion. It's expanded, it's more bloated. It was 19 billion in 2016. We can't borrow anymore. We've got £3 billion of debt. The bond markets are very, putting the price up far too great. We risk the IMF coming in. So I can't really see that working. And Wes Streeting, well, he's just resigned as health secretary. We did, you know, the May government actually did deliver the promise to spend 19 billion plus on the NHS. I know that because I was in number 10 when it happened, coincidentally, but it did actually happen. So Wes Streeting, what's he going to do? Is he going to cut back the NHS to pay for the EU? Or just bankrupt the economy further? Another benefit is trade deals. I spent 10 years in the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament for my sins. I met Mr. Modi on India. I met Mr. Trudeau when we did the Canada deal. I used the Canada deal for the idea of super Canada. And I'm grateful to Lord Frost, who's here today, who's acknowledged that. You know, it was my model for a UK-EU deal. And on India, I mean, I was born in India, actually. This is coincidental. Mr. Modi couldn't quite believe it, but I wasn't part of the Raj. I'm a bit young for that. But the EU deal, which I was meant to be doing a Campbell Bannerman report in European Parliament, took 15 years to negotiate. And UK comes along, and in 4 years, I think it was, we got a UK-India deal. It's worth billions because India it's overtaken us now as an economy, the size of the economy. It's really going places, but they love British produce, including Scotch whisky. And they put 150% tariffs on those luxury goods, as they call it. So this trade deal is of real benefit. And we are members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP as it's known, which is the largest trade bloc in the world. It's bigger than the EU, and the EU is not part of it. So there's a lot of benefits on trade. And as Danny Kruger and Michael Gove said on Question Time, key in economic sectors like agri-tech, fintech, life sciences, and of course AI, and those people in the audience here are experts in AI, we can steer a middle course in terms of regulation. We won't over-regulate, and we can stimulate innovation, which is a problem with the EU. It's not innovating. Parliament is sovereign again. I do take the exception of Northern Ireland, which we need to get back, as Jim said there. We need to get Northern back in the British single market as soon as we can. In my view, that's unfinished business. Whitehall obviously has pushed against it, and we need to sort that out when a centre-right government comes in. We've regained powers on key areas: trade, fishing, farming, energy, the environment. These are almost 100% EU-driven and controlled. Powers over state aid. It actually allows the Labour government to renationalise the railways without Brussels getting involved, or the steel industry without Brussels getting involved. It's now a British decision. Gordon Brown talked about British jobs for British workers. You remember, he got into trouble for it. Well, we can do that now because we can prioritise British companies. Now, the counterbalance of these benefits, you heard Project Fear in the referendum. But what happened to all those claims? Where the million jobs that were going to be lost, what happened to that? Nothing happened on that. In fact, we gained 1.5 million jobs since Brexit, funny enough. George Osborne's 35 billion emergency budget, well, that never happened. The City of London was going to lose influence. Well, JP Morgan was going to move 4,000 jobs to Paris, Frankfurt, whatever. But they actually imported 5,000 back the way to London. And now they're building a corporate headquarters in the city of, actually it's in Canary Wharf. It's going to be the highest skyscraper in Canary Wharf for 12,000 people. So, the point is, a lot of these myths at the time have been shown to be exactly that, that it didn't come to pass. And London is, of course, the second largest financial centre in the world, Paris the 17th, Frankfurt the 12th. And remember that, the City of London does not want to be involved with this reset. They've actually said no to Starmer. They do not want to go back to EU laws. That's a big, big win for our side of the argument. And then finally, international influence. We're meant to be a pariah. Well, you have Yvette Cooper leading the Council of Europe, which we're still in, 46 nations, 2 on the naughty step, Russia and Belarus. It was actually 48. The EU is only 27, and yet Yvette Cooper is there trying to reform the ECHR. I wish her luck. I don't think it's going to work, but at least, it shows that Britain can influence the world and it's not on its own. So all of that was proven to be wrong. You now have Project Mislead, as I call it. We've had Project Fear, now it's Project Mislead. And what they're doing is focusing on economic figures, and they keep coming out with all these studies with mysterious backers, putting money in. And Project Mislead, for example, it goes on about 4% loss of GDP, of our wealth, from Brexit. And one moment it's 4%, and then a few months later it's 8%. And I think, what about 16 or 32? I mean, it's all rubbish. It's all based on forecasts. The 4% is based on 13 forecasts, so it hasn't actually happened. And assumptions like no trade deal with the EU. Well, we've got the best trade deal with the EU that they've ever done, and that comes from the EU. That's what happened when Lord Frost delivered that deal. It was the best the EU's ever done. So that's nonsense as well. And this major barriers to trade that is driving the reset. Well, that's not true. We don't have any tariffs. We don't have any quotas. there's a bit of red tape, but we import massively from the EU, don't we? Everyone forgets that basic figure, that we actually import far more than we export. So since Brexit, exports to the EU have gone up 19%, 19%. They haven't gone down, they haven't collapsed. And to America, USA, is about 60% increase. And by the way, America as a country is our largest trading country, not bloc, but country. You know, we actually export more to the United States than to any country making up the EU. So here we are, we're back in the argument of the customs union and single market and all of that. And trade is very complex. And just think of the Corn Laws, think of the free trade election of 1906. Forgive me for mentioning this because a certain Campbell Bannerman won that election. He was a liberal. But he was a free trader, which is why Winston Churchill joined the Liberal government and CB gave him his first job. But listen to what he said about the Brussels Sugar Convention of 1902. Sounds very familiar. And this is him speaking. It means that we abandon our fiscal independence together with our free trade ways, that we subside in the 10th part of the Vergemachgerecht, a secret German court that is, which is to rect us what sugar should be countervailed. And the British Chancellor of the Exchequer in his robes obeys the orders he receives from the Foreign Convention, in which the Britisher is only 1 in 10, and the House of Commons humbly submits the whole transaction. Sir, of all the insane schemes offered to a free country as a boon, surely this is the maddest. Memo to Ed Davey, I think, don't support the customs union. Well, be liberals again, for heaven's sake. So, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, we are at a crossroads, and we either choose to respect democracy and the referendum result and to make Brexit work and to point out its positives, or we embrace the Starmer reset. And that is dishonest in my view. And I'm thinking of the grandma's footsteps game. Do you know that? Where someone is called grandma and people creep up behind, the kids often, creep up behind grandma, and you're not meant to be seen to be moving. Well, that is what's going on with this reset, where they're getting closer and closer and closer to being back in the EU, and they don't want to be seen to do it because they're afraid of the consequences. So that's grandma's footsteps for you, and it's dishonest. And just briefly on the reset, finally, it's a bit like the Stockholm Syndrome, I think. I mean, we've escaped the EU cell, the door is wide open, the chains are off, but Starmer and co. want to volunteer to be hostages again, volunteer hostages. It's kind of madness, and dynamic alignment, which Rachel Reeves talks about, is like master and slave. It is actually economic slavery. It's not positive at all. Turn to free movement, well, people don't want that. Surrendering of British fish, £12 billion. I was in Scotland recently, and Bucky needs its fish market back in northeast Scotland. SPS, this sounds very technical, sanitary and phytosanitary. Well, the point about that, by the way, is that at Geneva, I've witnessed a meeting at Geneva, and there are hundreds of delegates there who go to these SPS meetings. It's that critical. It's like a mini United Nations. So why is Labour just handing over that power to the EU? I think it's appalling. You've got emissions trading systems, you've got security and defence partnership. I don't think the French are going to give us any contracts. And Erasmus, finally. Now, Erasmus, we've got the Turing scheme, which is global, and it's about 1/5 of the cost. Why do we need to subsidise EU students again? I think a lot of commissioners want to send their children back to British universities. Why is that? The EU does not have any university in the top 10 in the world. We've got about 3, sometimes 4 in the world. So this is, why do we want to chain ourselves finally back to the EU? High tax, high unemployment, high debt, and pay billions for the privilege. It was Chancellor Friedrich Merz recently, he called the EU a complete failure. This is the Chancellor of Germany. And saying that Germany and Europe have wasted incredible potential. We have become the world champion of over-regulation and zero growth. We should sign them up, really, shouldn't it, Chancellor Merz? And Mario Draghi says that the EU is death for innovation. So we don't need this terrible deal. I say, and I think this whole conference is about, it's time to unbind Brexit. It's time to bin the reset, reinvest the billions elsewhere, and embrace the opportunities of Brexit. So Brexit unbound. Thank you.